to Season 3 of MFA Writers. Today's conversation, our first of the new season, features Stephen Duong of the Iowa Writers Workshop at the University of Iowa. This episode was requested by Tammy Breitweiser, Esty Downes, and April Ahmed. I hope you all enjoy the conversation as much as I did. I also hope everyone listening had a summer as rejuvenating as mine. I'm excited to be back for another season of interviews with some of the best emerging writers from around the country. Together, we'll hear some of their writing, learn about their process, and get a first-hand glimpse at the creative writing program where they study. In this way, I hope the podcast continues to be a resource for all emerging writers, including those considering an MFA in creative writing. If you enjoy it, I hope you'll reach out to us and consider supporting the program however you can. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. Soon, on our website, you'll also find ways to support us financially, if it's within your means. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Stephen Duong. Stephen is a writer from San Diego, California. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, the Watson Foundation, and the University of Iowa. And his poems, stories, and essays can be found in publications including the New England Review, the American Poetry Review, and Guernica. He is a current second-year MFA candidate in fiction at the Iowa Writers Workshop. Today, he's brought an excerpt from a fiction piece to read for us.
All right, this is Sandbox. The night I decided not to die, I was with two of my friends in a tall stone tower I had constructed myself. We were surrounded on all sides by zombies and skeletons. Our foes were ravenous and unending, and we were three. We bore swords. The moon was full and high. It was all very gothic. Online with them in that tall stone tower, I noticed my keyboard was slick with sweat, which meant something in my body must have considered this a convincing simulation of peril. What you need to know is this. I typically take 10 milligrams of hydroxyzine when confronted with peril, but that night I let it simmer because I wanted to be fully present with my friends, and I believed people under the influence of drugs prescribed by their psychiatrists lived half-lives, like ghosts, unable to wholly immerse themselves in the emotional currents of the world around them. I know this sounds dramatic. I believed this because it was how I felt most of the time. I behaved like a ghost then. I lived and worked in a small flat in Shanghai, making graphics for a literary nonprofit dedicated to young Asian American writers living abroad. At my desk, I crushed pills I'd brought from home into powders, the powders into finer powders. I went for days without speaking. My Mandarin was shit because I wasn't Chinese. When I wasn't working, I was walking up and down the street listening to podcasts in which famous non-Asian American writers gave frank and compelling writing advice. And when I wasn't doing that, I was online with Dan and Bronwyn. It was a life. Dan and Bronwyn were my friends, originally by proximity. They once lived in the dorm I lived in. Now they were commanding their avatars to fire arrows out the windows of my stone tower. Their avatars were grapes of corn and Bronwyn, men with rectangular bodies, cube heads, and long flat arms with no discernible hands to hold their longbows, which were fused to the ends of those arms like lighting fixtures. As each arrow connected with a zombie or skeleton, we would hear a grunt of injury, a rattling of bones. There was a small war on. I was too high to shoot any arrows, so I walked my avatar, Fake Diaspora 97, to the exact center of my stone tower with its cedar-paneled floors and said things like, "Nice shot, Dan," or "Get his ass, Bronwyn." I said these things to my headset, which was connected to Dan's and Bronwyn's headsets by a wireless form of magic. As I cheered my friends on, I imagined my avatar clutching his sword, whispering to himself a mantra his father had taught him in childhood. I am a good avatar with much to live for. Or maybe just live, asshole. War is hell. Whenever a monster breached our walls and lurched toward me, my friends cut it down where it stood. This warmed me. Each slaying felt like a small act of care, though I knew it was also just a fun thing to do, to slay a virtual zombie with one's virtual sword. Dan and Bronwyn actually enjoyed the perilous aspects of the very popular online game we played most nights, whereas I was just there to build things. I avoided the zombies and skeletons. I tried to forget the details of my job supporting young Asian American writers living abroad. My in-game days were spent putting up small buildings in the face of the virtual wilderness. Houses, barns, windmills, forts. I loved my buildings. I really did. In those long days, I built so much. I engaged in a sort of frontiersmanship. I chopped down trees and dredged the earth for minerals and ores. At the shore of a pond, I erected a pharmacy, a Korean grocery store, a tall stone tower, and in doing so ignored one of the central premises of the game, which is this. During the day, which lasts 10 real-time minutes, you can build what you like. But at night, which also lasts 10 real-time minutes, you will be besieged by monsters who seek to destroy you and your friends. What I did was continue to build at night while my friends defended me. I was selfish in that way. When I wasn't building, I was exploring the world. The farther Dan and Bronwyn and I strayed from our settlement, the larger our world became. This isn't a metaphor. The world was made of individual blocks arranged in a specific order, and we made it known to us. Bronwyn jokingly called us colonizers, but she was more or less right. The game's map generation code rendered the game world in 256 block tall 16 by 16 chunks as players moved through it, and so the more distance our avatars put between themselves and their original spawn point, the vaster the traversable world actually became. There were tundras and savannas and seas of molten lava in our world. Our world and all worlds were generated by things called seeds, random 32-bit integer values that determine what the world looked like as it was explored, its terrains, its biomes, the beasts that populated it. Every world had a unique seed, and so there were an infinite number of world permutations. A fully explored game world had 7 times the surface area of Earth, which was dizzying. When Dan first told me this as we were exploring, scaling a series of small mountains and building cabins at their peaks, I said, no fucking way. And he said, yes way, listen, we will never truly know even a fraction of our world, which is 1 seed in a game of 126 million active players. And I said, this information is going to kill me. And Bronwyn said, calm down, colonizers. From the tops of those mountains, we saw a great bay dotted with procedurally generated islands. I imagined visiting each one of them and planting a birch sapling in its center. I made plans. This is all to say that on the night I decided not to die, there was an algorithm at work, a great chain of logic that bound Dan's avatar and Bronwyn's avatar and my avatar to one another, while remaining ostensibly unfathomable and buried to us, the players.
Stephen, that was wonderful. Great reading. I really appreciate you being here and sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Jared.
So long before you dipped your toes into the fiction writing world, you were writing poetry. And you told me that your experience as a fiction writer feels very much rooted in your experience as a poet. How so?
Yeah, I definitely when I came into writing fiction, I was thinking of writing and language along the level of the line. I've always liked to work with formal poetry, especially like sonnets and ghazals and pantoums. And I think like that sense of constraint that those forms put on my writing was so valuable to me as a poet. Like just having the sense of compression and constraint allowed me to write things that I didn't really think I was capable of. And I think when it comes to fiction, even short fiction, I'm always thinking about how I can apply those same constraints to this form that feels a little more boundless than the poetry I'm used to. I still think that definitely comes into it. But I also think that with poetry specifically, I always was drawn to it for like that sense of play. the associative leaps that you take from place to place. You might start in one place and end up somewhere very foreign to the original starting point. And I think that sensibility, I admire that when I read it in fiction. And so I kind of try to also bring that to my fiction writing.
In what ways do you apply constraints to your fiction?
I'm drawn to prompts and kind of like setting my own artificial kind of constraints, although there are also like very, real constraints tied to plot, like this notion of like a ticking clock, or like I said, of stakes that need to be resolved in a certain amount of time. I think those are like, those are constraints that arise from the story. But I also am fascinated with, poets like Marian Moore, like the modernists, and then also like contemporary poets like Robin Schiff, who do things with syllabics, where they'll have these stanzas where, this first line has to be 11 syllables and the second line is 8 and then third line is 4. And this is like repeated throughout the book. I really do like those self-imposed, almost arbitrary constraints. And I sometimes find myself doing that, like with a story, before I know the title or really even where it's going. Sometimes I'll just have a set of words at the top as if it were a title, but it's really just like something I keep in mind as I write. Like for this story I've been working on called Sandbox, I think I originally had, different words and items from this video game I was playing that was like kind of informing the text. And I had them sort of like at the top, and I had sort of decided for myself that I wanted to write about this like very specific thing and this very specific experience. And so I think like by putting those kind of artificial prompts or constraints on the thing I was working on, I just ended up pushing myself in a direction that I ended up being pretty satisfied with. Although it changes a lot. It changes a lot as you write.
It's interesting though. It sounds counterintuitive, right? Like the idea of like putting constraints on your writing and somehow discovering something new in the process, or like achieving some kind of freedom in the piece from the constraints. But like I've found the same thing too. It's like sitting down at the blank page with fiction, there's kind of no rules, right? There's like kind of anything you can do if you don't have like that, the formal constraints that some poems have, right? And that can feel kind of overwhelming.
No, it freaks me out. Yeah. It's very daunting. Moving from poetry to fiction specifically, it's very daunting to have this like open page. There are margins, but there are no like line breaks. There are no stanza breaks. Like the kind of pressures that you exert on the text really just come from the structure of sentences and paragraphs and like this like larger sense of structure. And yeah, you get freaked out. So I think I have to like trick myself into thinking that it's something I can do. And then I realize that it is something that I can do, but I do have to, put those things in place.
So poets who end up writing fiction are often labeled as language-driven writers. Is this something that you identify with and embrace, or would you describe yourself differently?
Yeah, it's kind of funny to me. I guess the label of language-driven, because I think, this whole first year journey for me as like an MFA student in fiction has been really eye-opening, because I think before I started, I didn't exactly have the language to talk about fiction in a way that I felt was very sophisticated or at least like useful to my peers in a workshop setting, So a lot of it was, I felt very comfortable talking about poems and breaking them apart and discussing them in workshop. But with fiction, it felt a little bit more like foreign territory to me. So like just learning about, what are essentially like buzzwords or like terms like narrative consciousness or point of view or point of telling, or, all these things that I kind of implicitly knew about, but didn't have the language to really like express. It was all very fascinating to me, but then when I started encountering, people were like this like work of fiction is very much plot driven because of, these mechanisms in the plot that move it, versus this like piece of fiction is not plot driven. What else is it driven by if not plot? Okay, there's language, there's like character, there's, these other ways of like creating the machine, I guess, or the engine that moves the story. And so I think because I approach things at the level of like the language and the line at times, I think, I don't know, I've been either labeled as like a language driven writer or like, kind of led to believe that myself. And I used to think that, like it's important to me that, language to me is so important, that I didn't hesitate to like think of myself in that way. But I don't know. I think coming to Iowa in the first place was a matter, like I wanted to learn how to plot. I wanted to learn how to write like scenes and dialogue and characters that were like compelling and were driven with different engines than language. And I think it's also just like really easy when the language isn't like stark and spare to be like, that's clearly not plot driven because the language is X and Y. But that I think there are just like so many different moving parts, and that my time as a student in the past year has been like learning how to make all those parts move together. But I mean, there are a lot of like poets who end up writing novels or who end up writing fiction, who are maybe not read for the merits of their fiction, I guess.
Right.
So I think I get nervous. I get a little nervous when I encounter that kind of like talk, I guess, around poets who write novels or poets who write fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get nervous or resistant a bit to the idea of like a story being language driven or plot driven or character driven, because in my experience, within one story, it can be all of those things and it can change. The process is so fluid that like I might be working on one section of a story that's really being driven by the language, but then at some point the plot has to take over a little bit, or at another point I'm focusing more on the character, so it's more of a fluid process. And this idea of like labeling things, labeling stories or labeling writers as one thing or another thing, and the idea of that you can only be that thing, I'm a little resistant to it.
Yeah, and I feel like on some level, everyone who chooses to spend all their time writing is driven by language.
Right.
And so I think that like, yeah, some of those distinctions feel like tacked on, as opposed to like something that comes organically from reading and experiencing like a text.
Well, I'm curious about your writing process. Have you seen your process change at all when writing fiction as opposed to writing poetry?
I wish I could say that my process was something that I, conducted in the same way every time, and that was actually conducive to me writing a lot and writing things that I'm happy with. But I don't think that's like true, right now. I'm working on it. But I think I often do start with like lines that get stuck in my head, or sentences, lines, like little fragments that get stuck in my head, and that those often have to proceed and kind of unwind and make their way down the page before I can reach what the story is. So I think that's like often how I, generate things. But oftentimes I just kind of like sit there and butt my head against the computer until, until I have something. But I have been learning to think more carefully about like outlining and plot. And sometimes I start on paper with paper and pen. And I basically like have this notebook where I go at it with paper and pen. I'll free write until I kind of exhaust that energy. And then I'll begin to outline and plot. And I use like 5 or 6 highlighters and I just kind of go at it. Like all my stuff is like very color coded by, like dialogue fragments and themes and plot points and characters and details. And so it's like kind of disorganized, but I use the highlighters to kind of allow me to, I guess, see the distinct like categories of things I'm focused on or questions I'm asking on the page before I go to actually writing and actually typing. But I'd say like I'm definitely still figuring out a process that works for me. I do think with poems, things can kind of come in a flash. Mm-hmm. And you might be like working on a poem for like months at a time, but like the initial genesis was like that. But right. I found that like fiction, one flash isn't enough to get the ball rolling, I guess. And that sometimes fiction feels like an accumulation. but also the pressure of like a deadline really helps me. And I like speaking of like artificial constraints, like
right.
having the actual structure and deadline of a workshop schedule is very helpful for me, because I feel like, I have to push it to this specific date and turn something in. And I think that's always been helpful, whether it's with like a writing group or a more organized, like, school kind of structure.
Yeah. I think that can be one of the real benefits of an MFA program, is having those workshop deadlines that you have to meet. It kind of forces you to continually create new things and sit down and write new stories. Even if there isn't that flash of inspiration, you kind of have to push your process a little bit, push it to see what you can stir up without waiting for the flash to occur on its own, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's been really important to me as a fiction writer, especially in my first year at the workshop, just pushing myself to generate new work. And every time you're up for a workshop, just putting something down that is new. And I mean, I think I understand the merits of like bringing something you've worked on for a long time and using workshop to kind of like crack that nut, and to deal with problems you've been having for a long time and kind of address them from new angles with new eyes and new readers. But I think my own I place a lot of personal importance on just generating new work and forcing myself to bring new stuff to the table, just so I can be generating new stuff and feeling, like that the writing is sort of flowing.
Yeah, it's interesting, coming from the poetry background, not having a lot of fiction that you had written before entering the program, then, I imagine everything you're turning in really is like brand new stuff. And are there pros and cons to not having any kind of backup material to fall back on?
Yeah, I mean, the main con I would say is feeling extremely anxious when you don't have, something written, when there's like a deadline looming. But also I wonder, like, even if I had something, I imagine I'd be like, even if I had something, kind of in the vault or whatever, and I took it out, I feel like I would still be scrambling to, hew away at it and change it and make it different. Or I think I would probably still be anxious if my process was different, and if I was choosing to do that. But I am going into like in this coming fall, I'll be in a novel workshop for the first time, which is like, kind of daunting, considering my path from like, something poem sized to something short fiction sized to something book sized. So, sometimes I do wish I had like a bunch of things to pull out of the vault. But I also do think that there's something satisfying. There's something really fulfilling about having something like very fresh. And it's also this. Sorry if I'm like getting into program talk as opposed to like my own process, but it's been really humbling and cool to see other people who have a similar approach, who are putting down like very raw and kind of fresh new material. Makes me feel less self-conscious about coming from a different practice, essentially,
right.
and having to kind of find my way around a new practice and developing new patterns and ways of doing things.
Well, the piece you read today incorporates genre a bit, as the reader mostly follows the characters while in a video game, slaying zombies and skeletons. Is genre something that you enjoy playing with in your fiction?
Yeah, I definitely think that. So before I came to the program that I'm in now, I was mostly writing, relatively like realist, I guess, fiction that would occasionally, it's very lyrical stuff, but still pretty much grounded in the world as we know it. But like in the past few months, especially, I've found myself writing things that I guess could be described as speculative or magical realist in some ways. And I grew up reading just a lot of like sci-fi and fantasy. So I think that those kernels of otherworldliness tend to make their way in. And especially recently, the things I've been writing have definitely been tinged by, like sci-fi specifically. I do think I like pitting genres or like concepts that feel alien to one another together. I think that sometimes helps In a way that's almost like, it feels like a prompt to me, like making two things, some like seemingly dissimilar things fit in the same vessel. I feel like that sort of prompt or that sort of challenge is inspiring to me whenever I come across it. And so I often think about that for my own work. Like, I mean, like there's just an example, like one of the stories I wrote, in my first semester. Like I was definitely thinking and reading a lot of addiction narratives at the time, but also consuming a lot of like anime and things that have like this fantastical element. And so I ended up writing this story about like a TV writer who ends up getting spiritual counseling for her addiction, and ends up like interacting with actual spirits and actual like otherworldly entities and stuff, in her sort of like recovery journey. So I mean, I do think that I like thinking about genre and convention in a way that is both like a constraint and a kind of freeing challenge.
And you also mentioned that you're interested in metafiction, all the ways we might make writing and art about writing and art. What about this is interesting or inspiring to you?
Yeah, I mean, I know it can be kind of like, I don't know, like masturbatory or something, or like a little like self-involved. But I just feel like I really do love reading books about writers and artists struggling to make writing and art. I mean, I just didn't grow up, to be honest. I didn't grow up knowing that writers and artists were real people.
Right.
I don't know if that's like just like a very simple, like point at my childhood kind of explanation for it. But I just didn't grow up thinking that like artists and writers were real people. Like I assumed they were real at some point and that they had created this writing and this art and these books that I loved. And, you know, I assumed they created these things at some point, but I didn't believe that they could create things in front of me, you know, like in the
Right.
same, and I didn't believe they could really just like breathe the same air as me. I just thought of them as mythical, I guess. And then growing up, moving outside of the circles that I grew up in and, you know, the family that I grew up with, like, and realizing that people make all kinds of careers out of their writing and their art. And some people, you know, do not make careers out of their writing and their art, but they still place it at the center of their lives. Like those are the people in my own life, whether they've been my teachers or just my friends or peers. Like those are the people I find myself so thankful to be around, you know? And so thinking about what they do, which is doing everything in their power to place writing and art at the center of their lives, despite the kind of struggles associated with that life, those have been the most impactful to me in my own life. And so I'm always curious about writing that does that, or that tries to explore that. And I'm also just a sucker for writing that is like very evident of its writtenness, I guess, or like even like art that like, you know, like there's like, you can still see that there's like some kind of scaffolding there. You can still see like the remnants of like the process. I think I'm just kind of enamored with that. And so it ends up being a fixture in my writing. And also maybe because I'm a poet, I end up writing about characters that are poets because I find them weird and annoying and funny. I think that might also be it.
Another benefit, I think, of the MFA program is just being around people who are putting writing at the center of their lives, you know, just being around professors who have made a career out of it. It can be done, right? It's possible.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was definitely like a inflection point in my life when I realized that there were real options. There were real possibilities. Yeah. Those people have made me feel really possible, I guess.
Most listeners will know the program you're in as the one that started them all, the Iowa Writers Workshop at the University of Iowa. It's a 2-year fully funded program with tracks in fiction and poetry. There's a separate program for nonfiction writers. But the program you're in, everyone knows about and almost everyone applies to. And I think it often feels kind of out of reach, as if only people with a ton of experience in publications can actually get into the program. But that wasn't the case with you. Like you said, you started out as a poet and you hadn't really written that much fiction before applying to the program. So I was curious to hear you talk a bit more about what made you decide to apply to fiction programs instead of poetry, and what it was like to apply having not really written that much fiction beforehand.
Yeah, I applied during the pandemic, I guess. I was working from home. working for like a literary nonprofit in New York, but virtually from Boston, I think. It was kind of a shot in the dark. I don't know. I didn't apply for any programs that were not quote unquote fully funded, or at least I didn't think that it made sense for me to, I guess, apply to programs like this. I ended up applying to Iowa, to Michigan, I think Missioner, and maybe one other. I don't know. I didn't apply to a bunch of programs. I didn't really expect. I mean, you get your hopes up, and I didn't want to like get my hopes up, but I applied to just a handful because I was like, this is going to be a weird year, this pandemic year. Like the current class at all these places are probably still online. Like I don't know exactly what's going to happen, so I'm not going to like overextend myself. I'm just going to send these applications to schools that I really want to go to specifically, and that I would not pass up. Like if I got into any of them, and I specifically wanted to study fiction because I figured. It's not like I'm like, oh, like I'm a master of poetry already. I'm like, I've caught them all. I'm the Pokemon master of poetry. I didn't feel that way. I just felt that, if I were to spend 2 years focusing on a project or a series of works with peers and friends and professors, I would want it to be with fiction just because I felt like my poetry practice felt solid. Not like there's not more to be learned or because there's so much more to be learned. And I feel like even in this fiction program, I feel like my poetry has changed a lot. I just wanted to focus specifically on fiction. I knew I would be kind of going in with less experience, and I was very nervous about it. I just figured people at Iowa, there's that legacy and that history and all that. And I figured people would just be like quoting Chekhov to me or something, and I would be like, I have not read that specific thing, but I'm going to pretend I have. But I don't really feel that way now at the program. But I think I kind of lucked out. I mean, that seems like an ungrateful thing to say, maybe. But I applied to these programs, and Iowa was my first choice, and I got accepted with like a fellowship, and I sort of just like decided that day that I would go. I didn't really wait for other things. But I also, I done my undergraduate education in Iowa at Grinnell College, which is like an hour from Iowa City, and I had the good fortune of like visiting Iowa City and also taking a workshop with Sam Chang, the director of the workshop, before I like even thought about applying. And so I kind of like knew at least that this was a brilliant teacher that I had, and that if I were to like study fiction, I would love to study fiction with somebody like her or somebody who, has worked with her. Although it was funny, I think when I was applying, I like messaged her and I was like, oh, like I'm thinking of applying. Like, should I apply for poetry or fiction? And she told me that there had been a student or two in the past that had applied for both, gotten into both, and done both. A crazy amount of work, I guess. But then she also said, I will not be reading your application because you're my former student. Just keep that in mind. I'm passing it on to other faculty. But it was, I think, those kind of like fortuitous Iowa experiences that I had. I'd lived in Iowa for 4 years already, and I'd kind of known what I would, at least like vaguely what I was getting into. I think those are all those are all like factors that went into my decision. But at the end of the day, I just figured I want to learn fiction writing, and I want to be a fiction writer, and I want to do it among people who are very excited about this.
Well, obviously you're an incredibly talented writer, and that's why you were accepted. But I think it's good for readers to know that getting in is not always about experience and publications, right? I mean, Iowa is a big program, so I'm sure there's a diversity of experience levels.
Yeah, I think there honestly weren't. I think it was a majority of my cohort of like 25 students. A majority of them are not published. I mean, maybe I'm just like kind of guessing, but I would say like it's not atypical for students without like publishing credits or whatever to be accepted. And I had, published poetry, and I had a lot of experience with poetry, but not really very much with fiction. And so the stories I applied with were more or less, all the stories I had. And I think I thought I would be like a unique case or something, and that I would feel very intimidated by these other people, but it was more common than I expected.
You mentioned being a little worried before you attended that like you would be behind your peers in some way, or like that people would be quoting stuff to you that you hadn't read yet. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what the workshop experience actually was like. And do you feel like the professors do a good job of handling the varying degrees of experience that might exist in one workshop?
I think I've been lucky enough to have professors who are really like attentive to individual students' needs, as well as the kind of tendencies of their fiction or like their styles and their approaches. I've been lucky to have, my workshops, I had 2 last semester. My first was with Jamel Brinkley, and my second was with Sam Chang, but she was not there for the first half. So it was like sort of a split class between Yad Yassi and Sam Chang, both of who were like really wonderful professors. But I think that they are very attentive to like the differences in student writing, whether it's like something at the level of how it's constructed, whether it's like maybe used words like language driven and plot driven earlier and kind of decided that they were stupid. But but just like different varieties of fiction and also like different genre approaches. Like we have a professor, Kevin Brockmeyer, who has been really wonderful, especially to students who write speculative fiction or science fiction. They've found like his workshops really incredible specifically for that. And so I think what I expected was people writing at a very, very crisp, perfect level. Like every draft I would be reading would just be like absolutely brilliant, immediately a book or whatever. But I think people are there to learn, and people are there to better themselves and better their writing. And the professors all have that in mind. So everyone turned out to be very like humble and quite lovely, to be honest. I mean, in a class of 25-ish, I guess you don't have to be best friends with everybody, but I was just surprised by how many people were. I mean, this sounds bad. I mean, they're really down to earth, and they're really nice folks. And I think I had this like expectation of a hyper competitive, toxic kind of environment. And I mean, in some ways, like those things exist, but and I think they probably do everywhere. But I think overall, I felt that my peers were like very accommodating and very kind, and that they were generous readers, I guess. And I think the professors are similar, and especially the professors I had, Jamel and Sam and Ya, like they were all very generous with their time and their resources and their workshops. Like they would alter, the structure of the workshop depending on the work. If like a specific, like if we were reading a novel excerpt as opposed to, a short story, like Sam would just radically like revise her way of approaching it, or if it was like a piece that was very much about genre, like it was, very much working within like horror or something, like Jamel would just bring in a million quotes and supplemental materials about that specific genre and how this work interacts with it. I mean, I feel like he specifically would like basically write a mini like a lecture for every story that was up for workshop that would have to do with like every single thing about that specific story. I don't know. I felt lucky. I know this isn't the experience that everyone has or has had in the past, because I know like the program changes, or so I've heard. I've heard that like Sam has ushered in a different sort of like ethos. But I guess I've been lucky enough to find everyone there accommodating, kind, and generous with their time and their readership.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the competitiveness thing, because I think that Iowa has a reputation, at least online, of being like a really competitive place to study, where like you might be going up against your peers in some way,
Sure.
like some kind of competition. And I was curious to hear you talk about that and if that has been your experience. It sounds like it hasn't been. So is there a good sense of community amongst the people in your cohort?
Yeah, I would say there's a good sense of community. I think in any group of like 25-ish people, there will be like smaller groups or like a sense of, I don't know, what's the word? That there are like groups within groups, and like different overlapping shades of like groups of people. But I think something that has maybe tempered like a sense of competitiveness that might otherwise be there is that I think I found it difficult to see whether like the professors I've had specifically are like preferential, to like a certain student's writing, or treat students differently based on, how they understand the project that they're undertaking. Like I haven't really seen, I think if that was the case, like if you could clearly see, like that professor really like messes with these two writers' fiction and doesn't really care about everyone. Like, I think if that were the case, I might see this more often. But I think that the professors that I've been lucky enough to work with have kind of like tempered that sense. And also, I think, Iowa is like this prestigious program, and they do have all these resources to like bring agents and publishers or whatever to the school and like speak with students. And I think like there is that institutional power, I guess, that the program has just as a factor of its like history. But I guess I've been surprised. I've been surprised, and I've pleasantly surprised how some of those more like professional aspects have been at least not the central focus of students' lives and like classes and workshops. I feel like whenever we're workshopping, a piece, it's all just about that piece, and it's all about like, I guess, craft. Maybe that's like simplifying it, but I've at least been lucky enough. I mean, I wouldn't say there's no sense of competitiveness or no sense of competition at all. Because, I think every school can be more transparent about, like, for example, like how funding happens, or like how like TA-ships work, or, like all these things, all these kind of institutional elements that are at play. Like, I think Iowa could be more transparent about them, could be more egalitarian. But I do have the sense that like things are also in a process of changing towards, more equity, especially in terms of funding and sort of like financial assistance. And then also in terms of like the makeup of our cohorts. Cause I think my cohort was the first fiction cohort in Iowa's history to be majority writers of color. And again, that's not to say like every writer of color believes exactly what I believe about how fiction should be written and how the administration should work.
Right.
But it was kind of heartening, I guess, to be around kind of like a diverse group of writers.
I think maybe because Iowa, the university is in Iowa City, I think the program also has a reputation of being a bit homogenous, but that's cool that
sure.
like that your cohort is majority writers of color. So have you seen like a push for more diversity in the program in your time there?
I mean, I've only been there a year, but I mean, from speaking with students who've been there longer than me, or like even alums, I do get the sense that this is something that, especially under the leadership of Sam Chang specifically, that both like faculty and students seem to be more diverse than in the past. Though I don't know how things like change from year to year. Like, I don't know if like the incoming cohort is, like more or less diverse, whether it's like racially, ethnically, like sexual orientation, or even like the kinds of writing that are being foregrounded, I guess, in the admitted students or whatever. I've mostly just been surprised like how different everybody's projects are. Like, I think there is also a sense of like an MFA style or like an Iowa style, but it's at least for me, it's been really difficult to see what that is, just because people are submitting like really different, strange, fascinating works of fiction, that just seem to be like coming from so many different places. So at least on that level, I can't imagine that becoming more homogenous. I'm sure like the demographics may or may not change, but from what I've seen, like, I mean, for example, I was just surprised by how many people are writing things that fell along those like speculative lines. Pleasantly surprised. I just like to read different things every time, It's like, I feel so privileged to be able to read my peers' work at Iowa, because it's like, everybody's so weird and fascinating and like obviously talented, but everyone's very fascinating and weird in their own ways.
Yeah. One of the things I love about writers is that one of the best compliments that we give each other is that our writing is weird. I mean, that's like a great compliment. Oh, your writing is so weird. I love it.
Yeah. I think my experience would be a lot more difficult were my peers not so weird. Yeah.
Well, I think some listeners who have never lived in the Midwest might also be nervous about the idea of moving to Iowa City. So what has been your experience living there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm from California. I'm from San Diego, like suburbs for sure. And so I think both like a large city and a very more like rural setting would have been very weird for me. But like I studied at Grinnell College in Iowa, which it is in a very much it's a much smaller town than Iowa City, almost compared to my undergraduate experience, which was, a few years back. Feels like a metropolis. It feels like Taipei or something.
Which I think Iowa City has a population of 65,000, and half of those are students, I think.
Yeah. It's very much a college town in the Midwest. I was nervous for things like weather, or especially during the winter when you're cooped up in your one-bedroom apartment or whatever. Do you feel depressed? Do you feel really isolated? And I think those are all things I have felt from time to time, both living in Iowa elsewhere and living in Iowa City now. But I think another thing that has helped me, and not everyone has this, is having a car. I feel like that's definitely given me a sense of mobility and freedom that I otherwise would have had less, especially in the winter. But I think Iowa City's been a good place to write. And people say this, they're like, oh, it's not a bunch of distractions. It's not New York City. You're not you don't have all these places to go. But I think if you wanted to go places and have a specific kind of experience, there would be that. I just think that for me, it's been small enough, I guess, to contain my kind of routines without a ton of breakage in those routines. I think that's been the most important part of living in Iowa City for me. But I also feel like there are a lot of people in Iowa City who come from large cities on the coasts or whatever, and they're like, oh, Iowa City is the middle of nowhere. It's a cultural sinkhole. It's and I really do kind of resent that. Maybe it's because I lived in I lived in a pretty rural town in Iowa, although there's a massive divide between the college and the and the actual town or whatever. But I feel like there is a kind of unexpected breadth of diversity in culture and life in places like Iowa City and in the Midwest that people don't normally kind of conceive of it as having. And so, I like Iowa City, but I also understand if somebody finds it quaint. I really understand that. And I don't begrudge anyone, for wanting to go back to New York City so they can enjoy Cantonese cuisine. I get that, but there's more to it than somebody who's used to something else might initially imagine. But you should wear a jacket. You should bring a jacket.
Well, before we go, I want to give you the last word. And what I'm curious about is, what is one way in which the MFA experience has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when applying?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I expected the experience to feel very rarefied. I felt like I would be this very different person in this program. I would be this distinguished writer who is incredibly hyper serious about his work and is focused on this above everything, and this is a place for mastery, and this is a place for intense shaping of craft and of practice. And I think when I have wanted those things, I have been able to access them, but that overall there's just an openness, I guess, and a generosity that the students and the faculty have introduced me to that I felt was very welcoming to me, especially as a writer who maybe is not as familiar with fiction writing, as somebody else. I think I just expected a more, I didn't know what to expect, I have a couple of friends who, went into MFA programs before me, but that's just not something I don't have any relatives, or I don't really have people in my life who had done this before, who are significantly, older than me, and who knew what the way forward looked like. So I just didn't really know what to expect. I expected it to be really daunting and scary and intimidating. And although it can be at times, I've just felt really lucky to have found a community that I like, and that I found friends. Not all 25 of my cohort mates or whatever are my friends, but the couple of friends that I've found have been really dear to me, both as writers and as people. And so, no matter what happens, I guess, with this next and final year, I'll be really grateful for that, a handful of people that I've found. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that the experience has been a positive one so far, and wishing you nothing but the best in your last year in the program. And thank you so much for stopping by and sharing your experience with us.
Thanks, Jared. I appreciate you having me. Thanks for doing this. This is a really cool podcast and a really cool program that you have. I've talked to a couple of like writers who have, when they were thinking of applying to programs like this, like it was a good resource for them to hear somebody who's actually doing things in all these different programs. Yeah, this is really cool stuff that you're doing.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.